We're doing a week earlier than I anticipated, but I have 3 GM candidates and 3 head coach candidates for next season. That and more coming up on this episode of Locked On Commanders.
Your daily podcast on the Washington Commanders. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
And welcome into this episode of Locked On Commanders, your daily podcast covering the Washington Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks so much for making Locked On Commanders your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget that you can subscribe to this show on YouTube or wherever you're getting your podcast, and you can do it for free. You can also become a Locked On Commanders insider. Continue this conversation with me by going to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnCommanders. And from there, you text me, I text you, you news, insights, bonus content, all of it via text message one-on-one with me. Again, join subtext.com/LockedOnCommanders to become a Lock Insider today. I'm David Harrison, your host for this show, credentialed member of the media covering the Washington Commanders for CommanderCountry.com, a part of Sports Illustrated's FanNation. I'm here with you every Monday through Friday, along with our everydayers who I appreciate for your continued support for the program. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any $5 bet. That's $150 just for playing. So visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started today. On today's episode, we're going to look at the impacts of a potential new hire as general manager and head coach of this football team in the NFL draft. But we're going to get started with the GM and the head coaching searches, starting with the head coaches. And I honestly had planned on kind of saving these topics for after Black Monday comes, after the last regular season game of the year and the official moves are being made. But the conversation is already being had widespread. So I figure it's time, you know what I mean? It's not too early. It's time to get into these conversations. I'm going to start this off with the head coaching candidates that I'm looking at right now. And there are several. So if your favorite is not on here, don't think that your favorite is not going to get discussed at any point in time. These are just kind of the top 3 that I'm looking at right now. And so we're going to start it off with Eric Bieniemy. I think you have to start off with the Washington Commanders' own assistant head coach, offensive coordinator, who I think certainly will likely get an interview, should get an interview with Josh Harris and the decision makers that are going to help him find out who his next head coach is going to be. And, you know, there's been a lot of conversation about whether or not Ron Rivera should be fired in season so that Eric Bieniemy can basically get his audition going, or his in-season, interview started with Josh Harris in this group. And I've kind of said this before, so every day this is going to sound familiar, but really Eric Bieniemy has been interviewing all season long. You know what I mean? Like, Josh Harris has been in the building. He's been at the games. He's been talking to these guys. He's getting to know who these people are as a staff. And so he's learning who Eric Bieniemy is, and he's learning his style and all those things. And Eric Bieniemy has been, running the schedule and doing all these things. So there's been an interview process. Now, he hasn't been the full, obviously full head coach, but he certainly has been able to show Josh Harris more up front and close and personal than any other coaching candidate is going to be able to, right? So he's obviously got the upper leg. In that standpoint, as long as what he's doing and how he's interacting with Josh Harris is actually making a good impression. If it's not, then, Josh probably already has his feelings on that. Honestly, I would think by now Josh Harris kind of has his feels on whether or not he wants Eric Bieniemy to be his next coach or not. And then from there, it's just about going through the process and making sure that you're checking all your corners and doing your due diligence, right? So the pros for Eric Bieniemy, obviously, the continuity with the team, the remaining offensive players would know him, know what to expect, know his scheme, know his language, all of those things. And the coaches that are left over, same deal there. So continuity is part of that. Depending on how much you want continuity with what's been going on with this franchise, that's going to be a pro, or it could be actually be a con in some ways, right? Super Bowl pedigree. Certainly Eric Bieniemy has been on multiple Super Bowl staffs. He's on multiple Super Bowl rings. So we always like to kind of take the adage of, if he's been on the staff and he's seen how it's done, seeing kind of what makes it work and what doesn't, and should be able to bring some of those lessons over. It doesn't always work out that way. The Bill Belichick tree has a lot of Super Bowl rings on it, but not a whole lot of Super Bowl winning coaches outside of New England. So, it depends on how effective that really is at the end of the day. The cons, stubbornness. This season, I think we've seen a lot of stubbornness out of Eric Bieniemy. EB has used the phrase, EB is going to be EB, no matter what. type of thing. And obviously you have to stay true to yourself, to a certain aspect. But I think what has really bothered people this season is the lack of contextual play calling and adjustments being made. Like as the season goes on and you see that you have, a young quarterback early on behind a struggling offensive line, later on behind a struggling mindset, the adjustments in play calling, the adjustments in gameplay just aren't there. Basically, it's the adage of this is my scheme, you go execute, that's your job. And again, leaders have to be flexible. At the end of the day, you don't have to change who you are, but you do have to be flexible with your planning based on your strengths of your staff and your personnel. And I don't see a lot of that coming out of Eric Bieniemy in his adjustments and in his willingness to use guys mostly like Brian Robinson Jr. or scheme up ways to get the ball to Terry McLaurin, two of his best playmakers on the team. And to me, that is a problem in today's NFL. You're going to get figured out. And if you come in, week out for 18 plus weeks, just doing the same thing you want to do every single week, you're going to get figured out. And teams are too smart these days. And I think that's some of what we've seen down the later stretch of the season. The ownership has an accountable eye. That's another con, I think, in this conversation. We've talked to Coach Ron Rivera a lot this season about his conversation with Josh Harris and the ownership group, and they're interested. They're involved. You know what I mean? Like they're not silent partners here. They want input. They have input. They've got their guy Eugene Shen. You know what I mean? I don't know how much Eric Bieniemy is going to be really into the whole analytics thing. I don't think Andy Reid is much of an analytics guy, things like that. But I'm not an expert on the Andy Reid mentality, but it's one of these things where it looks like a collaborative attempt at running an NFL team versus just hire the coach and the coach goes and does what he does. So if EB is not willing to be a little bit more collaborative and kind of explain what he's doing to the ownership group and all those things, then that certainly is going to be a problem. So Eric Bieniemy, again, certainly deserves an opportunity to interview. Certainly like every interaction I've had with him personally. But I think there are some pros and there are some cons to the potential of EB staying on board as the head coach. Another hot candidate around the NFL head coaching conversations, Ben Johnson, Detroit Lions offensive coordinator, got some offers or got at least one offer I know of last season, decided to come back and become the Detroit Lions offensive coordinator. There's been some rumors circulating. Usually those are coming from agents. So, take it for what it's worth, but it certainly sounds like Ben Johnson is ready to step into the head coaching arena this offseason. Some pros. The Lions have been top 5 in scoring and yards in 2022, currently top 5 in scoring and yards in 2023 as well. So that would be back-to-back years that the Detroit Lions finished top 5 in those categories. And you certainly love that amount of production coming from the type of leader that I think most people want for their Commanders team. And Dan Campbell kind of has that aggressive in-your-face type of mentality, but does it without being kind of overly rigid with his players. So I think that's kind of the good mix that you want in your staff. So if Ben Johnson has adopted any of that, then potentially it's a good fit for what Commanders fans seem to want in their next head coach. Cons, doesn't seem to have much of a counter when his scheme doesn't work. Watching Detroit Lion games this season, haven't watched them all, full disclosure, but I've watched at least 5 or 6 Detroit Lions games. When the scheme works, it works really great. But when it doesn't work, he doesn't seem to have a whole lot of counters, kind of just sticks with what he's doing. And that, to me, is indicative of, once your offense gets figured out, once your team gets figured out, if you don't have the talent to necessarily get over that hump on its own, you're not going to do a whole lot schematically to really change it. Kind of relies on what he thinks is going to work versus reading the game flow. Final candidate we're going to talk about here today, Mike Macdonald, Baltimore Ravens defensive coordinator. Pros, he's been with the Ravens from 2015 to 2020, and then again 2022, 2023. Only one losing season in that stretch. Comes from a franchise with a strong history of developing homegrown talent, but also maximizes free agent additions. He's been groomed by special teams head coach John Harbaugh. Head coach John Harbaugh comes from a special teams background. Only 2 years on the staff that the defense was not top 10 in scoring defense. Cons, rush defense is 27th in yards per attempt, 13th in yards per game because the explosive offense is keeping teams from being able to run the ball against them. But pass defense is first in yards per play and 6th in yards per game. So despite the fact that they're in a lot of shootouts, they're certainly built to withstand them. My current favorite of the 3 coaching candidates would be Mike Macdonald, the Baltimore Ravens defensive coordinator. Right now, some other names to watch: Bobby Slowick, the Houston Texans offensive coordinator; Dan Quinn, Dallas Cowboys defensive coordinator; Frank Smith, Dolphins offensive coordinator; Brian Flores, Vikings defensive coordinator; and Jim Harbaugh, the head coach of the Michigan Wolverines. I will tell you, that I could get behind and get, somewhat excited behind pretty much every one of those candidates. So I think the odds that the Washington Commanders get themselves a pretty solid head coach this coming season are pretty good. But the head coach conversation is just part of the equation. I've got three candidates, my three top candidates for the Commanders general manager job coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And this episode is brought to you by FanDuel. The NFL regular season is wrapping up, but there's still time to get in on the action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers, you get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. That's $150 in bonus bets, win or lose. The largest spread in the beginning of the week for NFL Week 18 belongs to the Dallas Cowboys, who are 13.5-point favorites over the Washington Commanders, while the closest belongs to the Indianapolis Colts, who are just 1.5-point favorites to beat the Houston Texans. The app is so easy to use, and there's so many different ways to bet, like live same-game parlays. You can find bets in the new Explore tab. You can make a parlay in the Parlay Hub, which is the best way to find popular parlays. I love building parlays, and you can do so much more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon, make your first bet a layup, and you'll get $150 in bonus bets once you make that bet. FanDuel, official partner of the National Football League. Continuing on with today's episode of Locked On Commanders. Thanks again for making Locked On Commanders your first listener, your first view today and every day. Every dayers come back tomorrow. We got another mailbag episode, last mailbag of the regular season. Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every single league. Go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and subscribe to the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel. I identified three primary head coaching candidates that I'm looking at right now early on, obviously, in this process. My understanding is that firm offers cannot be made until January 8th. So we do have a little bit of time, not a whole lot of time, but I mean that, I don't think that you're going to be hearing of a head coaching hire, on Monday of next week. I think you're looking at a little bit of a process at least. And of course, some of these guys could be or will be coaching in the playoffs, and that's going to kind of complicate things and so on and so forth. Which honestly, it's one of those things that I understand why it has to happen. But I really, really wish the NFL would find some sort of mechanism to make it, to where coaches that are coaching in the playoffs can focus on what they're doing instead of focusing on head coaching interviews and all those other things. I don't like it for the current status of the teams and everything. I don't know. Maybe you move the NFL draft to May, and you move the combine to March, and you move the Senior Bowl to February, and you let these coaches coach and you let them do what they need to do. All those things. I don't know. Anyway. Different soapbox type of moment that doesn't impact the Washington Commanders right now anyway, right? Turning now to the general manager. Obviously, this general manager head coaching duo is going to be very important. And I don't know right now how Josh Harris plans to attack this thing. Some owners, they have the general manager hire the coach. Some owners, they hire each individually and basically both work for the owner. Some head coaches actually have the power more so than the general manager. So I don't know how Josh Harris plans to attack this thing. But I figure, the head coach is obviously the one that you're going to see the most, talk about the most, and hear from the most. So that's why we start with the head coach, and then we go to the GM. It's not because I think there's a priority over one or the other. But looking at GM candidates, the first one we're going to talk about here on this list of three is Adam Peters, 49ers assistant GM currently. The pros, he's been working with John Lynch. Obviously, John Lynch has been a masterful general manager since he joined the San Francisco 49ers out of the broadcast booth. Peters has been learning from him ever since 2018. He's been their assistant GM in San Francisco for 3 years now. Previous to that, he was the vice president of player personnel for San Francisco and was in various scouting positions with the Denver Broncos from 2009 to 2016 before that. And if you remember, those Broncos rosters, pretty talented overall from 2009 to 2016. Cons, he might want to stay in San Francisco. There is a school of thought I read. I can't remember who it was, but somebody wrote about how, John Lynch has kind of gotten this elevated title in San Francisco where it's not just general manager. And that actually may lead to him vacating the general manager title altogether. And then Adam Peters could become the full-blown general manager while John Lynch kind of has an oversight role in those things. So could possibly stay in San Francisco. Bottom line is, even if he doesn't stay in San Francisco, he is going to be arguably the most sought after GM candidate in this cycle, I think. And that's one of the reasons we started with them. It's essentially one of those situations where it's almost like he's not interviewing for you, but you're interviewing for him. You're interviewing to show him that you're the right organization for him to want to jump onto versus you saying, why are you good for our organization? That's a little bit of a different dynamic than usual. But that's how good the 49ers have been. And when you come from that environment, that's kind of how it goes sometimes. Next candidate we're going to look at here, Mike Borgonzi, Kansas City Chiefs assistant GM. He's been in Kansas City for 15 seasons now. It's a lot of seasons. His first season there, the Kansas City Chiefs were 4-12 and hadn't made the playoffs in 3 years. Since then, Kansas City has only missed the playoffs 3 times and has won 2 Super Bowls, been to 3. Roster and cap management has led to 8 straight AFC West Division titles, 9 in the past 15 years. I mean, there's just a lot of success going on in Kansas City. And I know that this season they're kind of having, kind of a down year, but really it's a down year for them because they're still the AFC West champs, still clearly the best team in that division. So it's just a down year for them because that's how high the bar has been set. If you're the Kansas City Chiefs. Cons, again, he may decide to stay in Kansas City. I mean, there's a lot of success going on there. There could be a path where he kind of takes that position somewhere down the road, those things like that. And he's also going to be tied to other jobs. He's also going to be a highly sought after candidate. The Chiefs haven't exactly been masters of the trade. I think that's kind of, if you look at him versus a guy like Adam Peters, like the 49ers are almost routinely just fleecing teams in the trade market, whereas the Kansas City Chiefs are not quite as active or quite as established in that arena, but certainly cap management, contract management, things like that. Very, very strong. Bonus pro, he knows Eric Bieniemy more than anybody does right now. You know what I mean? Even though he's been on ground here for a year, even though Josh Harris has got to know him for a year, so on and so forth. If he comes in, if he's your hire and he doesn't want Eric Bieniemy as your head coach, there is a reason for it. If he does want Eric Bieniemy as your head coach, there's a reason for it. So it makes your head coaching candidacy a little bit easier. At least it helps you peg or eliminate Eric Bieniemy a little bit faster, again, than if you would, if you don't already have that decision made. But again, if you're Josh Harris, you've been around EB for quite a while now, and you kind of see the way he operates, and I think you kind of have a feeling on whether or not he's the kind of guy that you want to work with moving forward. Last of the 3 GM candidates, and again, these aren't the only ones. So if your favorite isn't on the list, don't fret. You know what I mean? We're going to talk about more certainly as we get through this process, and certainly as reports come through of interviews, we will whittle down to those guys even more. Joe Horitz, Baltimore Ravens director of player personnel, pros there, history of success in Baltimore. Again, it's no coincidence that we're talking about a Baltimore coach and we're talking about a Baltimore GM. One, they're right up the road, so you get a really good view of how successful they've been. But, the Baltimore Ravens just have that reputation. Homegrown talent is a big thing. Acquisitions are successful usually, but also not afraid to move on from mistakes. And I think that's something that if he brings that from the Ravens organization is really valuable. You look at Rashad Perryman, one of the bigger draft busts in Ravens history. He was only with the team for 2 seasons. 2 seasons, they kind of said, okay, look, this ain't working. You move on. I think they moved him to Cleveland. And all those things. But all at the same time, they don't miss on first rounders that much. But when they do, like I said, you like the fact that there's the integrity enough and the professionalism enough to say, okay, we messed up. Let's move on from this and not just try to continue to make this fit. Because I think, I've said this before, every day you're going to recognize this phrase, but making a bad decision is one thing. Sticking with the bad decision is even worse. So that actually makes me a little bit happier with a guy like Joe Horitz coming from that type of atmosphere. Cons, was never given the assistant general manager title. And again, that's a lot of that is kind of surface. It really is just more so what his job entailed there with the Baltimore Ravens. Hard to gauge how impactful that really is, but just from a on the surface aesthetic standpoint, you would like to have some traditional general manager jobs or tasks going onto his resume. But he's the only one on the list that is like that. Should be highly sought after. Again, is a guy that I expect to get multiple interviews. But I think he could like the idea of not having to move too far. I don't know which side of Baltimore he lives on, but if he does have to move at all, it's not going to be very far. Living in the Baltimore, Maryland area. My current favorite of these 3 GM candidates is Adam Peters, the San Francisco 49ers assistant GM. And I think the combination of Peters and Baltimore Ravens defense coordinator Mike Macdonald as the head coach gives you 3 decades plus of experience from 2 of the more consistent competitors in the league today. and two that have also done it in different ways. So I think that's important. That gives you different ideas and you can kind of mesh and do those things. Coach McDonald was with Baltimore when Eugene Shen worked there. So you have a connection there as well. And Peters would come into a familiar situation with draft picks. He was with the San Francisco 49ers when they traded back one spot with the Chicago Bears. The Bears moved up to get a quarterback. San Francisco traded back from 2 to 3, and they also got a third rounder, a fourth rounder that same year, and a third rounder the next year. So with Washington in their current draft position, Adam Peters would have a very familiar stance with that draft position if they decide not to go quarterback. Also, Coach McDonald comes from a very aggressive defense in Baltimore, but it also gets praised for being able to adjust on the fly as needed to face its adversary. So I like the idea of a coach that can come in with a plan, be aggressive, but also understand when it's time to shift off that plan onto an alternate plan and do it successfully. So what could that trade of a draft pick look like if this GM is brought in, and what could the draft class look like to suit this new head coach? That's coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by PrizePicks. PrizePicks is the largest daily fantasy sports platform in North America. They are the easiest and the most exciting way to play DFS because it's just you against the numbers. Instead of battling thousands of other players, including pros and sharks, you pick more than or less than on 2 to 6 player set projections. Sit back and watch the games with more invested than ever before. It's early still, so some of the options are limited for the National Football League's Week 18 schedule of games. But right now, I'm going with Buccaneers quarterback Baker Mayfield to have more than 223.5 yards passing against Carolina Panthers, and Seahawks running back Kenneth Walker III to have more than 62.5 rushing yards against the Arizona Cardinals. PrizePicks even offers a reboot policy so that your entries stay in play even if one of your players gets injured. For football and basketball games, if you have a player who exits the game in the first half, does not return in the second, that player is rebooted. PrizePicks is the only daily fantasy sports platform with an insurance policy. So go to prizepicks.com, use the promo code prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL, use the promo code LockedOnNFL, all in lowercase, for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, that promo code LockedOnNFL, all lowercase, for a first deposit match up to $100 at prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL. PrizePicks, daily fantasy sports made easy. Wrapping up today's episode of Locked On Commanders with a mock draft. We talked about our head coach candidates, our GM candidates, and again, right now, my preferred duo would be Adam Peters, the assistant general manager of the San Francisco 49ers, being hired as the new Washington Commanders general manager, and Baltimore Ravens defensive coordinator Mike Macdonald being hired as the new head coach. So if Mike Macdonald comes in, runs the same system that he's running in Baltimore, which you assume, then you're looking at an odd front defense, also known as a 3-4 defense, which, selfishly is actually the defense that I prefer the most in the National Football League. And of course, Adam Peters, coming from the San Francisco 49ers, has pretty good experience being on a staff that executed a trade years ago to go back one spot in the top 5 of the NFL draft to trade back with a team that wanted to trade up for a quarterback. And so that's a coincidence. It truly is, but it is something we're going to flesh out here. We're going to go ahead and do a 7-round mock draft here. I told you guys every day, as you know this, I don't really like doing 7-round mocks at this stage, and we're not even in the offseason yet, but in the offseason, because we don't have all the comp picks fleshed out yet. So these picks are going to move beyond the 3rd round. So just take it with a grain of salt. The picks from the 4th round on are going to move, and so some of the players that are available are certainly going to change. And obviously, during the draft process, some of these players are going to move up and down the boards as we go anyway. But starting with the number 2 overall pick, which is where the Washington Commanders are currently scheduled to pick and certainly could be picking after the end of Week 18, we're going to execute a trade. And we're going to execute basically the exact same trade that the 49ers executed with the Chicago Bears all those years ago. So in this trade, the New England Patriots get number 2 overall. The Washington Commanders get number 3, number 67, number 103 overall this year, and they get a 2025 3rd-round pick. That means after the trade, the Washington Commanders have the number 3, number 34, 42, 66, 67, 100, 102, 103, 139, 180, and 223rd picks in the NFL draft. That is a lot of draft capital. That is a solid way, along with almost $100 million or $100 million after you reorganize some things, of cap space. I mean, guys, And obviously the draft comes out free agency. So put the cart before the horse just a little bit there. But with the third overall pick, everydayers, you're not going to be surprised here. Left tackle Olu Fashanu out of Penn State. In this mock draft, again, I ran this through PFF. The Chicago Bears take Drake May, actually. The Chicago Bears took Caleb Williams. The New England Patriots trade up with us. They get Drake May. We get left tackle Olu Fashanu out of Penn State, start to secure that offensive line. 34th overall pick. Defensive lineman Leonard Taylor III out of Miami, Florida, the Hurricanes program. He comes in projected as a 3-4, 4-eye tech defensive lineman. Call him a defensive end, call him whatever you want. Sometimes he'll be reduced, sometimes he'll be outside. It doesn't matter. But bottom line, one of the edges of your defensive line there with the 34th overall pick. 42nd overall pick again in the second round. I'm double dipping, guys. I'm going defensive line again. This time, Chris Jenkins out of Minnesota projects as a 3-4 nose tackle, and I'm moving Deron Payne to the other outside edge. So basically our defensive line after the first two rounds looks like Chris Jenkins in the middle, Leonard Taylor III, and Deron Payne on either end of him as your starting defensive line. So starting to secure the trenches just a little bit there. We come back in the third round, the 66th overall pick. I'm going tight end Jatavion Sanders out of Texas. Get us a nice big receiving tight end who also has some blocking potential. 67th pick. Right after that, we're right back on the clock. We're going linebacker Peyton Wilson out of NC State. So our first 5 picks, we're going to the trenches 3 times. We're getting another playmaker for whoever our quarterback is going to be, and we're trying to shore up our linebacker position with an off-ball linebacker and Peyton Wilson to join Jamin Davis, maybe Khaleke Hudson, maybe Cody Barton. Who knows who gets retained and re-signed and who doesn't. With our next pick, we're going to actually trade up in this scenario. We're trading the number 100 and number 102 overall picks to the Seattle Seahawks for pick number 77. Now, the Seattle Seahawks have a history of trading back in the NFL draft. So this is a move that they could actually look to make. And they also own the number 79th overall pick right now. So trading one of those 2 picks is certainly within the realm of reality for the Seattle Seahawks. And it's in their wheelhouse again, as it's something they like to do. They like to trade back in the first round almost every single year, but certainly enjoy trading back, collecting more picks. With the 77th overall pick now, we take wide receiver Johnny Wilson out of Florida State. So you look at this Washington Commanders weapons, the group of weapons, and what are they missing? They're missing a 6'7" playmaker. So we go get one of those out of Florida State before the end of round 3. So right there, all of this stuff is actually in the realm of possibility. Like as of right now, and again, we'll have to see how draft stocks fluctuate and all that stuff. But as people stand right now in their draft evaluations, and with trades and all that stuff, this is actually in the realm of possibility if Adam Peters came in here and executed a similar trade like the one that he was a part of when the 49ers traded back with the Chicago Bears. Now, moving forward, again, these picks, 4th round on, these picks are going to move because of compensatory picks, so it's kind of grain of salt time here. 4th pick, 103 overall, center Cedric Van Pran out of Georgia. 5th round pick, 139 overall, cornerback Kyrie Jackson out of Oregon. He's a press man cover, long, athletic. And again, if you're going to move to a Mike McDonald scheme, you're going to need that odd front defensive line. You're going to need off-ball linebackers that can have range and make plays, and you're going to need some press man corners. 6th round, 180th pick, safety Lathan Ransom out of Ohio State. He is a coverage safety. Derek Forrest, Cam Curl, if they come back, I look at both of them as more box safety, strong safety types. So you need yourself a cover safety back there to compete again. 6th round pick. I'm not saying he's going to start. Hopefully there are some free agent additions, things like that. But you do need a guy at least to get in there and add some depth. 7th round pick, 223rd overall, outside linebacker Zion Tupuola-Fatui out of Washington. He is a true pass rushing outside linebacker to bring in as a 7th round pick. So in that draft class, you got 6 top 100 picks, 2 offensive linemen, 2 defensive linemen, 2 linebackers, 1 safety, 1 cornerback, 1 tight end, 1 receiver, 9 players total added through the NFL draft. And that is on top of whatever you were able to accomplish in free agency. So that's just a taste. Again, drafting for a lot of new pieces because this new defense is going to need it if the head coach brings in a new style, but also securing the trenches and doing some things that we haven't seen happen here in far too long. So that is my head coach candidate preview, GM candidate preview, mock draft based on my 2 preferred hires as of right now. Coming up tomorrow, we got a mailbag episode. So if you got questions about any of these guys, players, playoffs, whatever it is, drop them in the YouTube comment section or hit me directly by texting me as a Locked Insider. Go to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnCommanders to become a Locked On Commanders Insider, and you'll get text messages from me all off season long. Again, it's not going to stop when the season stops, guys. My next stop after Week 18 is the Senior Bowl in Mobile, Alabama. So I'll be texting you from there as well. As always, thank you so much for making Locked On Commanders your first listen of the day every day. Thanks for coming through on a regular basis like you do. Thank you so much for making me a part of your day, part of your football routine. And until we speak again, if you're out and about, please be safe, be kind. I'll see you next time right back here for another episode of Locked On Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.